Here's the truth most men don't want to hear. She didn't leave because you cared too much. She left because your attention became predictable, constant, and low value. And here's the part that will change everything for you. People don't come back because you convince them. They come back when they feel your absence and question their decision. This is where no contact stops being a tactic and starts becoming power. Scarcity creates value because the human mind is wired to prioritize what feels limited, uncertain, or at risk of being lost. When something is always available, it becomes predictable, and predictability reduces emotional intensity. In relationships, this shows up when one person is constantly present, always responding, always initiating, always giving attention without pause. At first, that consistency may feel comforting, but over time, it lowers perceived value because there is no tension, no curiosity, and no sense of effort required to maintain the connection. The brain stops registering that person as something to pursue and starts categorizing them as something guaranteed. And once something feels guaranteed, it loses its emotional edge. When you introduce scarcity, especially through no contact, you interrupt that pattern. You remove the constant flow of attention that the other person had adapted to. This creates a psychological gap, and the mind immediately tries to fill that gap with questions. Where did they go? Why did they stop reaching out? Did they lose interest? That uncertainty reactivates attention and emotional engagement. It forces the other person to think about you in a way they haven't had to before, because now your presence is no longer something they can access whenever they want. Scarcity doesn't create attraction from nothing, but it amplifies whatever attraction was already there by making it more noticeable and more mentally engaging. There's also a deeper layer tied to perceived effort and reward. People tend to value what they have to work for more than what is freely given without resistance. When your attention is always available, it requires no effort to receive it, and as a result, it's not deeply appreciated. But when that same attention becomes limited, it starts to feel like something that needs to be earned again. This shift changes the dynamic from passive receiving to active pursuit. It's not about manipulation, it's about restoring a natural balance where both people feel the need to invest, rather than one person carrying the entire emotional weight. Scarcity reintroduces that balance by making your time, energy, and presence feel like something valuable again, not something assumed. Emotional contrast triggers reflection because the human mind needs distance to properly process feelings, and without that distance, everything becomes blurred into routine. When you're constantly present in someone's life, texting every day, seeing each other frequently, maintaining the same emotional rhythm, there's no clear distinction between having you and not having you. You become part of their normal environment, like background noise that's always there but rarely examined. In that state, people don't actively think about your value or your role in their life because there's nothing interrupting the pattern. The brain adapts quickly to consistency, and once it adapts, it stops questioning, evaluating, or appreciating at a deeper level. When no contact is introduced, that steady emotional baseline is suddenly disrupted. The absence creates contrast. And contrast is what forces awareness. Instead of a constant presence, there is now a noticeable gap where your attention, your energy, and your interaction used to be. That gap becomes impossible to ignore because it breaks the routine the other person had grown used to. The mind naturally reacts to this disruption by trying to make sense of it, replaying past interactions, reconsidering how things ended, and questioning whether the decision to pull away was the right one. Without you there to fill the silence, they are left alone with their thoughts, and that's where reflection begins to take shape in a more honest and unfiltered way. This process also shifts emotional perspective. When you're always available, any frustration, boredom, or negative emotion can overshadow the positive aspects of the connection because there's no space to step back and see the bigger picture. But when distance is created, those immediate emotions fade, and what remains are the more meaningful impressions tied to memory and emotional impact. People start remembering how you made them feel rather than focusing on small irritations or temporary conflicts. The absence acts as a filter, removing the noise and leaving behind the core emotional experience of the relationship. This often leads to a more balanced internal evaluation, where your positive qualities become more prominent simply because they are no longer competing with constant, everyday exposure. At the same time, emotional contrast introduces a sense of uncertainty, and uncertainty heightens attention. When someone can no longer predict your behavior or access your presence, their mind becomes more engaged in trying to understand what changed. This increased attention leads to deeper thinking, not just about you, but about themselves, their choices, their reactions, and the role they played in the dynamic. Instead of passively experiencing the relationship, they begin actively analyzing it. And that shift from passive to active engagement is what drives genuine reflection rather than surface-level reaction. Loss of control reverses power dynamics because in most relationships, control is not openly discussed but constantly felt through patterns of behavior. When one person becomes predictable, always initiating contact, always responding quickly, always trying to fix things, they slowly hand over emotional control without realizing it. The other person begins to set the pace of the interaction, deciding when to engage, when to pull back, and how much attention to give. This imbalance doesn't always happen intentionally, but once it's established, it shapes how both people perceive each other. The one who is more available appears more invested, while the one who is less available appears more in control. Over time, this dynamic can reduce attraction because control often gets associated with higher value, while excessive availability can signal dependence. When you initiate no contact, you disrupt that established pattern. The person who was used to having consistent access to you suddenly loses that access, and with it, their sense of control over the interaction. They can no longer predict your behavior or rely on your presence to validate their position in the dynamic. This creates a psychological shift where they move from a position of certainty to one of uncertainty. The roles begin to reverse, not because you are trying to dominate the situation, but because you have removed the behaviors that were giving them control in the first place. Without your constant effort maintaining the connection, they are left in a position where they have to decide whether to step forward or let the distance grow. This loss of control triggers a natural human response, the desire to regain it. People are uncomfortable when they feel they've lost influence over something that once felt stable and predictable. In relationships, this often shows up as renewed curiosity, increased attention, or even attempts to re-establish communication. It's not always a conscious strategy on their part. It's a reaction to the sudden change in dynamics. When they realize that you are no longer orbiting around them, it challenges the assumptions they had formed about your availability and emotional investment. That challenge forces them to reassess your value because now you are no longer someone they can easily access or influence. At a deeper level, this shift also impacts how they perceive your self-worth. When you stop chasing and step back, it signals that your emotional state is not dependent on their actions. That independence alters the way they view your position in the relationship, making you appear more grounded and self-assured. Power dynamics in relationships are closely tied to perception, and when your behavior reflects control over your own emotions rather than a need for external validation, it naturally changes how the other person responds and engages with you. Unfinished emotional loops stay open because the human mind is wired to seek closure, especially in situations where emotions were intense but resolution was incomplete. In relationships, most endings are not clean or fully understood. There are things left unsaid, feelings that weren't properly expressed, and moments that didn't reach a clear conclusion. When a connection ends without clarity, the brain doesn't simply move on. It keeps returning to those unresolved points, trying to make sense of what happened. This is known as the need for cognitive and emotional closure, where the mind replays past interactions in an attempt to complete a story that feels unfinished. The stronger the emotional investment was, the more persistent this loop becomes, because the mind struggles to accept an ending that doesn't feel fully processed. When you maintain constant contact after a breakup or emotional distance, you interfere with this natural process. Instead of allowing the loop to remain open and intensify, you provide ongoing interaction that temporarily soothes the discomfort. This creates a false sense of continuation, where the relationship feels like it hasn't truly ended, even if the connection has weakened. As a result, the other person doesn't feel the full weight of the loss because there is still access to your attention and emotional presence. The loop never fully activates, and without that activation, there is no urgency to reflect, question, or seek deeper understanding. The relationship becomes something that fades gradually rather than something that demands resolution. No contact changes this dynamic by removing that ongoing access and forcing the emotional loop to remain open without interruption. Without new interactions to dilute the past, the mind turns inward and begins to process what was left unresolved. This often leads to increased rumination, where the other person starts thinking more frequently about specific moments, conversations, and emotional experiences they had with you. They may begin to question their decisions, reconsider how they handled certain situations, and feel a growing need to revisit the connection in order to resolve those lingering thoughts. The absence doesn't just create distance, it amplifies the importance of what hasn't been settled, making the emotional loop more active and more difficult to ignore. At the same time, unresolved emotional loops tend to idealize parts of the relationship over time. Without ongoing interaction to balance perception, the mind often highlights meaningful or positive experiences while minimizing the reasons things fell apart. This selective recall strengthens the emotional pull toward the past because the connection starts to feel more significant in memory than it may have felt in reality. The longer the loop remains open without closure, the stronger the internal pressure becomes to resolve it, whether that means reaching out, seeking answers, or attempting to reconnect in order to finally complete what was left unfinished. Self-worth is perceived, not declared, because people don't base their judgments on what you say about yourself. They base them on how you behave, what you tolerate, and the standards you consistently enforce. You can say you respect yourself, you can explain your intentions, you can even try to prove your value through words, but none of it carries weight if your actions communicate the opposite. In relationships, perception is built through patterns. If you are always available, always adjusting, always trying to secure someone's attention, it signals that your sense of worth is tied to their response. Even if your intentions are genuine, the behavior itself creates an image of dependency rather than confidence. And once that perception forms, it shapes how the other person treats you, often without them consciously realizing it. This is why over-explaining, over-giving, and over-chasing tend to backfire. They come from a place of wanting to be understood or appreciated, but they communicate a lack of internal stability. When someone feels that you are trying to convince them of your value, it subtly suggests that you don't fully believe in it yourself. Confidence, on the other hand, doesn't seek validation in the same way. It operates quietly through boundaries, through selective attention, and through the willingness to walk away from anything that doesn't align with your standards. These behaviors create a different kind of impression, one where your value is assumed rather than argued. People respond to that because it feels grounded and consistent, not forced or reactive. No contact reinforces this perception by removing the behaviors that often undermine self-worth. When you stop reaching out, stop explaining yourself, and stop trying to maintain a connection that isn't being reciprocated, you shift the message you are sending. Instead of saying, "I need this to work," your actions begin to communicate, "I choose myself when things aren't aligned." That shift is powerful because it is visible without being verbal. The other person experiences your absence not just as distance, but as a signal that you are no longer operating from a place of need. This changes how they interpret your past behavior and your current mindset, because now there is a contrast between who you were and who you appear to be becoming. Over time, consistent behavior rooted in self-respect reshapes perception in a lasting way. When you maintain boundaries, when you don't react impulsively, and when you prioritize your own emotional stability, it becomes clear that your worth is not dependent on external validation. This doesn't guarantee that someone will come back, but it does ensure that if they do, they are responding to a version of you that is grounded, self-assured, and no longer trying to earn a place in their life through constant effort. Attraction grows in space, not pressure, because desire depends on emotional breathing room. When someone feels constantly pursued, through frequent messages, repeated check-ins, or the need for immediate reassurance, the interaction starts to feel like an obligation rather than a choice. Pressure removes the sense of freedom that attraction needs to develop naturally. Instead of leaning in out of genuine interest, the other person begins to respond out of habit, politeness, or even avoidance of conflict. Over time, this creates emotional fatigue, where the connection feels heavy rather than engaging. The more pressure is applied, the more the other person instinctively pulls back to regain their sense of independence. Not necessarily because they've lost all interest, but because the dynamic no longer feels balanced. Space changes that dynamic by reintroducing autonomy. When you step back and reduce your presence, you remove the constant demand for interaction. This allows the other person to experience their thoughts and emotions without influence or expectation. In that space, attraction has room to rebuild because it's no longer competing with pressure. Instead of reacting to you, they begin to think about you on their own terms. This shift from external stimulation to internal reflection is where genuine desire can start to form again. When someone reaches out after space has been established, it feels intentional rather than reactive, and that distinction matters because attraction is tied to voluntary engagement, not forced interaction. There is also a psychological element tied to anticipation. When communication is constant, there is no build-up, no sense of waiting, and no opportunity for curiosity to grow. Everything is immediate, which removes the emotional tension that fuels attraction. Space introduces a delay between interactions, and within that delay, anticipation develops. The mind starts to fill in the gaps, wondering when the next interaction will happen and what it will feel like. This anticipation increases emotional investment because the experience becomes something to look forward to rather than something that is always available. The absence of pressure allows these subtle emotional processes to take place without interference, creating a more engaging and dynamic connection. At the same time, space forces both people to reconnect with their own lives outside the relationship. When you are not constantly focused on maintaining contact, you naturally redirect your energy toward personal growth, responsibilities, and other social connections. This not only strengthens your sense of identity, but also makes your presence more impactful when you do re-engage. Instead of being someone who is always there, you become someone who brings a distinct energy into the interaction. That contrast between presence and absence is what keeps attraction active over time because it prevents the connection from becoming predictable or emotionally flat. At the end of the day, none of this is about manipulating someone into chasing you or trying to control how they feel. It's about understanding how attraction actually works and refusing to abandon your self-respect just to keep someone in your life. When you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, and stop making someone else the center of your emotional world, you create a different standard for how you show up in relationships. That standard isn't built on fear of losing someone. It's built on knowing that your value doesn't decrease just because someone else fails to recognize it. No contact, space, and emotional discipline are not tactics to win someone back. They are tools to regain control over yourself. Because the truth is, the moment you feel like you have to convince someone to stay, you've already stepped out of alignment with your own worth. Real attraction doesn't come from pressure, persistence, or constant availability. It comes from presence, confidence, and the ability to walk away when something isn't right. And when you fully understand that, you stop focusing on whether someone will come back and start focusing on whether they even deserve a place in your life anymore.